Periods of literature may be most effectively defined by the questions they seek to answer. For the Greeks, one might say that these were questions of what it means to act virtuously, perform one's duties, or avoid excess. For the Romantics, these were questions of what it means to be free or to be a subject. For the Postmoderns, there is a new primacy placed on the question, what does it mean to be a reader? Marred by the history of Western philosophy and its representationalist assumptions, Western literature has tended to treat the reader as a neutral receptacle for the imparting of information, allowing the microcosm of the book to lead one towards statements of truth regarding the world beyond the book. To be an authentic and faithful reader was to set one's ideas to the side and submit to the will of the author. However, postmodern literature approaches the reader in a markedly different way, accepting the reader as he or she is. That is, fraught with biases, normative assumptions, frames of reference, expectations, beliefs, and goals. As such, to be a postmodern reader is to interrogate the reading experience as an active site of contestation and negotiation. Especially when considering such key works of postmodern literary criticism as Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author, it is clear that postmodernism has gone further than any other literary movement in redefining what it means to be a reader. In particular, this has entailed not only respecting the nuances of the readerly perspective, but also accepting the reader's active role as a participant in the literary process. One such mode of participation that has long gone under-theorized is the role of the body. While many postmodern authors have gone to varying lengths to employ formal techniques for segmenting and disrupting the readerly experience, such as William Burroughs' cut-up technique, nobody in the postmodern tradition has more thoroughly implicated the reader's body as a participant in the literary experience and its political implications as Thomas Pynchon. In his seminal work, Gravity's Rainbow, Pynchon thematizes the bodily not only via its content, sadomasochism, body horror, the experience of death, self-fragmentation, etc., but also through its active invocation of the reader's body as a participant in reading and the construction of meaning itself. As I have continually read Gravity's Rainbow, I've often found my typical reading experience diverted by an imminent scatological need. However, in spite of such a change being viewed as a disruption or a perversion of the typical armchair reading experience, I will argue here that recontextualizing the reading environment and the ensuing alteration of bodily affects that result from the process of shitting, one can not only see Pynchon's scatological work in a new light, but can actively participate in the literary experience in a radically new way. Postmodernism is perhaps most famous for its critically oriented approach. The very project, indeed, can perhaps only be clearly articulated with reference to what it rejects or criticizes. One of the most foundational presuppositions of Western philosophy which is challenged by postmodernism is the fixity and oneness of truth. Such an assumption can be observed at the very earliest stages of Western philosophical development when Socrates asks rhetorically in Plato's Republic, "Have we any greater evil for a city than what splits it and makes it many instead of one?" Or when he observes that philosophers are those who are able to grasp what is always the same in all respects. Consider also the following dialogue in the Republic between Socrates and Adeimantus. Socrates asks, "Can a multitude accept or believe that the fair itself, rather than the many fair things, or anything in itself, is, rather than the many particular things?" "Not in the least," Adeimantus said. "Then it's impossible," I said, "that a multitude be philosophic." Such passages highlight the centrality of truth as a static concept, indifferent to humans and our desires, goals, and beliefs. In addition, it privileges the unitary as opposed to the multitude as the highest intellectual ideal. Postmodernism, on the other hand, privileges the multiplicity of possible readers, interpretations, and meanings associated with any text, locating the text as a site of contestation. Even the most simple sentences in postmodernism often intentionally seek to subvert the supposed unitariness of the text, such as Derrida's statement, "There is doubtless no real secret at the bottom of this sentence, no determined proper name." Rather than seeking to find what is really real, postmodern literature focuses on the simulation and presentation of meaning, which the text is qua projection. Rather than seeing the text as a solid medium upon which the reader stands, the reader is instead constantly diffused into the literary medium, which is liminal, fluid-like, and gap-laden, or what Derrida refers to as the holocaust of play itself. Far from being a mere exercise in futility, postmodernism's emphasis on the fragmentary and liminal seeks to ground our conceptual thinking in the lived experience from which it is belatedly constructed. Whereas classical thinkers such as Plato seek to invent an ideal for what human experience is and what the ideal society ought to be, postmodern thinkers align closely with the American pragmatists, particularly John Dewey, in the redefinition of experience. Such reading is, after all, not merely a reading equation or tacit representation, but rather a reading experience. And therefore, it behooves one to consider how a more transparent appraisal of everyday experience may alter one's conception of the reading experience. Contrary to the assumption made by most classical and modernist philosophers, John Dewey, the foremost of the classic American pragmatists, reappraises experience as not primarily a knowledge affair, stating that experience means primarily not knowledge, but ways of doing and suffering. Such ways are necessarily forward-reaching, extending one's reach beyond the mere instantaneity of the moment and into the yet-to-be recesses of the future. As such, to be, or the ontological question, is inextricably linked to what it means to be, the hermeneutical question. Such a blending of ontology and hermeneutics is central to the thought of Martin Heidegger from his earliest writings on the subject in Being and Time. In that work, Heidegger theorizes ontological investigation as seamlessly and irrevocably tied to a hermeneutic circle, which inevitably entails the continual interrogation of what it means to act and live in the world. Such an insistence on the relevance of values such as one's for the sake of which, or worum willen, or vocation, in ontological inquiry, has had a lasting impact on the way fact and value are implicated in one another. As such, later pragmatists such as Richard Rorty have insisted that there is no clear distinction to be drawn between questions of meaning and questions of fact. To speak of a value-free life is not only incoherent but undesirable, since it seems plain that literature and philosophy ought to be intimately concerned with the way we humans are led to act by our values. To create a literary space devoid of bias or perspective and beholden to the rationalist ideal of the reason-based God's eye point of view seems both an ontological blunder as well as a disservice to readers everywhere. Now, it must be admitted that such a rationalist ideal permeates not only the entirety of Western culture, but also the literature resulting from that culture. The presupposition that experience is primarily a knowledge affair is surely a wish. Perhaps it is a useful or even a desirable wish, but such a position has been thoroughly dismantled by a number of thinkers, from Heidegger to the American pragmatists to the postmodernists. To choose one instance from a number of possible alternatives, let us refer to the thought of John Dewey again. As much as we would like to hope that the way we humans go about living and experiencing is that of rationally representing the world propositionally, Dewey maintains the following. Negatively, a prior and non-empirical notion of the self is the source of the prevailing belief that experience as such is primarily cognitional, a knowledge affair. In other words, the only reason it is even possible to conceive of humans as, say, rational animals, as Aristotle would have it, is because of a primary mode of selfhood that acts as the foundation upon which any conceptual scheme can be formed. This is Dasein in Heidegger's thought. Prior to analytic, rational, cognitive, and intentional experience, we are affective machines, seamlessly interfacing with the world in the mode of what Hubert Dreyfus has aptly called skillful coping. Far from our experience being one chiefly operating in the mode of rational observation, in which a subject can be meaningfully differentiated from an observed object, Dewey maintains that we as human beings are deeply intertwined with the world with which we occupy and concern ourselves, such that it would be reductive, artificial, and imposed to pretend as if the desired or primary mode of experience is something detached or barred from the world. Prior to our formal conception of, say, water, to use Dewey's example, it occurs as a stimulus to action and is the source of certain undergoings. It is something to react to. In this twofold way, water or anything else enters into experience. Such presence and experience has of itself nothing to do with knowledge or consciousness. All experience, in any medium whatsoever, depends upon prior experience of this non-cognitive sort, and can only be made sensible due to the pre-ontological input of one's everyday background experience. Now, what does all this have to do with postmodernism? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. Postmodern writers can, with relative ease, be confidently juxtaposed with realist writers. The latter focuses on the text as a precise medium for the delivery of a carefully curated aesthetic message and representation of the world. However, postmodernism has long been skeptical of the realist approach due to its insistence on the ability to disentangle the reader from the author's writing. The realist authors doubtless command their pen with great might, blending together a concoction of precisely specified and proportioned elements. Authorial intention is the centerpiece of this realist tradition. To use a somewhat stereotypical example, consider Joyce's precise command of style and form in Ulysses in, for example, the infamous Oxen of the Sun chapter, in which Joyce slowly ascends chronologically through a parody timeline of English language prose, starting with early English translations of Latin, all the way to contemporary Irish slang of his day. Such a literary artifice stands as much to communicate as it does to betray command of style and the ability of the author to use language as a tool whose intricacies can be carefully mapped and employed. Far from my point here being to deride the postmoderns as devoid of the stylistic command of their predecessors, I merely wish to showcase the change in priorities. While the realist tradition tends towards a correspondence or representationalist theory of truth, wherein a subject, say the reader, creates a mental representation that corresponds to varying degrees to the objective content of the world to which it refers, the postmoderns radically depart from such an epistemology. As an exemplary case, consider the epistemology implied in Roland Barthes' famous essay, The Death of the Author. Barthes states at the very beginning that writing is the destruction of every voice, of every point of origin. Writing is that neutral, composite, oblique space where our subject slips away, the negative where all identity is lost, starting with the very identity of the body of writing. Considering the inability of the reader to latch onto and objectively justify or ascertain an author's meaning, since the text presents itself as a site of radical play, the authority of the author can no longer be relied on as the hermeneutical touchstone it once was. What are we to do if we have an alternate, perhaps even daring interpretation of a text, particularly of, say, a rather orthodox and canonized text? While the traditional literary critic would perhaps deride many modern-day quote-unquote radical interpretations as diverging so far from the author's intentions so as to be incorrect, postmodern literature not only accepts such a possibility but often encourages it. The postmodern text seriously calls into question the idea of the author, a concept that many postmoderns have rightly criticized as a post hoc rationalization and idealization of the fragmentary actual individual of the writer. As Barthes states, the author, when believed in, is always conceived of as the past of his own book. Book and author stand automatically on a single line, divided into a before and an after. The author is thought to nourish the book, which is to say that he exists before it, thinks, suffers, lives for it, is in the same relation of antecedence to his work as a father to his child. In other words, he approaches it intentionalistically. In complete contrast, the modern scripter is born simultaneously with the text, is in no way equipped with a being preceding or exceeding the writing, is not the subject with the book as predicate. There is no other time than that of the Annunciation, and every text is eternally written here and now. In line with the postmodern rejection of the unitariness of the world and the rational simplicity of experience, the unitariness of the author is also rejected. In contrast, the author is de-idealized and returned to his proper place amongst his fellow human beings. Rather than having an a priori, almost godlike position of privilege in the hermeneutical project, the author, while being acknowledged for his skill and potential for insight, is at the very least radically undermined as the interpretive end-all be-all, if not entirely rejected as our locus of meaning. This decentering of the work of literature leads to a totally new understanding of what art and human experience in general does. Rather than privileging verisimilitude, correspondence, or representative authenticity, the question should always be, what use is it, rather than is it real? No longer is the privileged goal of intellectual inquiry the static idea of Plato, but rather the mobile, processual medium that is the world. Instead of privileging the object point of view, which views truth as a question of knowing objects, postmodernism, as well as its pragmatist brother in thought, privileges the event point of view, which views life as a series of active assertions of various agents in the world. Such a conception of what it means to be has radical implications for what it is to be made of the reader and writer roles in literature. For, as Barthes states, the fact is, or rather it follows, that writing can no longer designate an operation of recording, notation, representation, depiction, as the classics would say. Rather, it designates exactly what linguists, referring to Oxford philosophy, call a performative, a rare verbal form exclusively given in the first person and in the present tense, in which the enunciation has no other content, contains no other proposition than the act by which it is uttered. As such, any role in literature must be reframed as an active role in which one's role is inextricably linked to one's values, beliefs, and goals. The decentering of the reader and writer roles not only thematizes and criticizes the heretofore static body of the text, but, by establishing the centrality of performativity, thematizes and criticizes the body itself. Such a trend is perhaps one of the most enduring and culturally radical aspects of postmodernism. While the subject of this paper is Pynchon, a more exemplary case of the extremity of bodily thematization may be best found in the work of William Burroughs. There is perhaps no other author who so directly and thoroughly implicates the body in his or her writings than does Burroughs. Take as an example a sloppy and sensuous orgy scene from Burroughs's The Soft Machine. Stale underwater of penny arcades slipping down legs, rectums feeling the warm sun, laughing and washing each other, soapy hands in his crotch, pearly spasms stirring the warm water, whiff of dried jism in the bandana trailing sweet young breath through remote lands, soft globs on a brass bed in Mexico, naked, wet, carbolic soap, tight nuts, piece of soap in the locker room rubbing each other off to my blue heaven, grinning as the other two watched. Or, alternatively, consider the fashioning by a comandante of the protagonist Carl's body seamlessly into that of a woman, explicitly exposing the body as a site where binaries are to be undermined. The comandante spread jelly over Carl's naked, paralyzed body. The comandante was molding a woman. Carl could feel his body draining into the woman mold, his genitals dissolving, tits swelling as the comandante penetrated, applying a few touches to face and hair. Jism across the mud wall and the dawn sound of barking dogs and running water. Down there, the comandante going through his incantations around Carl's empty body. The body rose, presenting an erection, masturbates in front of the comandante. Penis flesh spreads through his body, bursting in orgasm explosions. Granite cocks ejaculate lava under a black cloud boiling with monster crustaceans. Extreme as these passages may be, it would be a lie to say the body is anything but the central planet of this literary solar system. While postmodern authors, as this analogy may have alluded to, respect the necessity of form and the impossibility of an ineffable experience being directly indicated through literature, such rapture is approached through the manipulation of the form to accompany and accentuate the disjunct, extreme content of the previous passages. Form here becomes not a constraint or limitation, barring the author from his reader and thus the reader from the world of meaning lying behind the text. Instead, form becomes a tool of bodily affective disruption, by which the author invokes and excites within the reader the same, or at least similar, affections as those that befall the fictional characters. One of the exemplary cases of this formal technique of literature towards disruption is Burroughs's cut-up technique. Burroughs, with the help of Brian Gysin, developed this method by literally cutting written material out of daily life, be it in the form of newspapers, books, transcripts, letters, proofs, etc., and juxtaposing them within the same text in such a way that radically undermines authorial intention as the meaning-making mechanism of literature. Instead, the vicissitudes of daily life yield the entrails of the literary body without organs that is the text. All this material is smushed together in such a way that it cannot be said to constitute an organism, that is, a coherently ordered and structured whole whose parts interlink, having been guided to their current position by a seamless process of adaptation to the environment. Instead, it is merely a textual body that cohabits a common space that is actively contested and yet somehow remains intact. Rather than being the result of a continuous process, the cut-up method artificially imposes a series of discontinuities which undercut the simplicity and unitariness of the idealized text. Instead, the text enters history as a gradually amalgamated mass derived from a human experience whose nature is not radically different from the reader's own. We fold writers of all time in together and record radio programs, movie soundtracks, TV and jukebox songs, all the words of the world stirring around in a cement mixer and pour in the resistance message. Calling partisans of all nation, cut word lines, shift linguals, free doorways, vibrate tourists, word falling, photo falling, breakthrough in gray room. The cut-up technique, however, is not just a significatory flourish, as it may initially seem. It opens up the text and reading as significatory experimentation that actively implicates and demands the body, not merely the mind. The reason the postmoderns take their texts to such limits of grotesquerie, disparateness, abstraction, and fantasy is to forcibly implicate the reader as not just a mind receptacle, but a body that undergoes constant affective experience. Contrary to the assumption made by many that postmodernism is solely a critical project, whose goal is to undermine all form, values, and matters of fact, postmodernism is in fact perhaps the greatest opportunity for creativity that the contemporary reader has. When we tend to associate creativity with the process of writing a work of literature, it must be recognized that, considering the implication of the reader as bodily agent in the reading progress, and thus directly implicated in the text, the reader is himself a creator whose work is that of interpretation. But is this all? If we're to take seriously the American pragmatists' emphasis on the primacy of lived experience, then ought genuine literature be primarily concerned with lived experience, not the abstract and letter-based medium of the text? Ought this not to invoke the body? This may sound like a fine objection in principle, but one may ask what this actually entails for the reader. As much as we would like to directly induce feelings of ecstasy, paranoia, pleasure, anxiety, contentment, or any number of other complex emotions in others through the intermediary of literature, it must be admitted that at the end of the day, we're dealing with black marks on a white page, both of which do, in the strictest sense, absolutely nothing. But what if we as readers were to radically redefine what it means to implicate one's actions in a work of literature? Well, for that, I propose one do as my title suggests: read Pynchon while taking a shit. Now, odd as this request may sound, and yes, this is a genuine request, I've found that it speaks to the heart of what it means to be a reader, which is to say, a human being who only occasionally happens to be reading and immersed in the static material signifiers of letters. To be a reader, just as one could well say for being a philosopher, anthropologist, doctor, or contract killer, is not to be a reader on some transcendental level. It is not to be a human being who sees the world in a primarily literary way. Rather, it is merely to be someone who happens to read in between the throbbing pragmatic throes of everyday life, which has nothing to do with reading. As such, to accept one's role as reader as being one not divorced from the world at the moment the reading begins, is to accept the constant openness that the body possesses. It is to accept that my reading process is irrevocably linked to the experiences that have occurred in my day heretofore, as well as those potential experiences that are to come, including the possibility of the occasional oncoming and imminently threatening devastation of a shit barreling towards its bodily exit. At such a moment, only Pynchon could command one's attention so fully as to demand that one's attention stays fixed on the reading, whilst one hobbles towards the gaping mouth of the toilet receptacle, which sits in giddy anticipation. As I have found through numerous trial runs of such a literary experiment, performed at the behest not of my will, but of my body's cruel and oft untimely vicissitudes, the affective experience of shitting, far from detracting from some idealized reading experience, often serves to prophetically anticipate and subsequently accentuate the scatological subject matter of Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. Absurd as this may sound, I submit to the reader a challenge. Be creative, even as a reader. Whether it's through the active process of note-taking, walking while reading, or yes, even shitting while reading, treat the readerly experience as a malleable and contestable medium that is constantly invoking you as an individual. As a well of untapped potential, not only does the text allow for a myriad of interpretations, but it accepts that you create said interpretations while still allowing the text to say something new by doing so. One is certainly warranted in echoing Zarathustra's opening words of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. You great star, what would your happiness be if you had not those for whom you shine? The text, too, is a star, constantly irradiating significatory flames, flames which beg to be lit. Pure and figureless, this light burns all. It burns itself in the all-burning it is, leaves of itself or anything, no trace, no mark, no sign of passage. Pure consuming destruction, pure effusion of light without shadow, noon without contrary, without resistance, without obstacle, waves, showers, streams ablaze with light. The text is a challenge and the reader a challenger. Far from an analytic problem whose solution stands ready-made, the text commands creativity and flirtation. As Joyce says, perdition stinks before us.